Okay, sorry about that. Looks like I'm having DNS issues. I mentioned at the start that I've got a couple of technical problems. It feels like I'm having some issues with my internet connection. Okay, well, let's get started and hopefully this will be okay. So the first lesson we're going to go through tonight, we only have two lessons. The first is comparing security roles and security controls. And so we're looking at basically what different roles would we expect to find in an organization, and then the different kinds of frameworks that exist for defining how we do security and that sort of thing. So starting off looking at different security roles, and really the first topic that we have to discuss when it comes to security is the CIA triad. Pretty much everything that we do when it comes to security is going to be based off of the CIA triad. This is the foundation for everything. Whenever we look at any kind of system or process or any other, any asset or anything like that that is delivering an IT service, we need to look at confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And typically it's in that order as far as what the priority is. So when we talk about confidentiality means that only the people who should see the information can see the information. Okay, so if there are a handful of people that should have access to that data, then those are the only people that have access to the data. We want to make sure that we maintain confidentiality on our systems. The next is integrity. And integrity can mean really one of two things. Number one, we know the source of the information. Okay, so if Carlos sends me an email, then I know for sure that it came from Carlos and it couldn't have come from anybody else. Okay, so that's one part of integrity. The other part of integrity is that when that data got sent to me, it arrived intact and unchanged. Data should not have any kind of modification or change to it without the appropriate authorization. Okay, so if, again, using Carlos as an example, he sends me an email. Okay, how do I know for sure that the contents of the message was not somehow changed in between where he sent it and I received it? So confidentiality is making sure only the appropriate or authorized people see the information. Integrity is making sure that only the authorized or appropriate people can change the information. And then availability. We have to make sure that the services, the systems, the data, the whatever are available, that it's accessible, that, again, Carlos is going to send me an email. Well, if that's going to happen, the email service has to be available and he has to be able to send a message. I have to be able to receive a message. So CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, pretty much everything we do and everything that, that we look at for integrity or for security is going to be based upon that foundation, establishing the CIA triad. Now, there is a fourth principle here that goes along with it, and that is the principle of non-repudiation. Non-repudiation means that a user's actions cannot be denied. Non-repudiation means that if you perform some sort of action on the network, we know that you are the one who did it and you cannot deny having done it. Now, that's not necessarily, that isn't a sinister thing. We just need to make sure that whatever activity is occurring on the network, that we know who did it. And so that principle of non-repudiation is very, very important. So again, this is kind of the foundation. Everything we talk about in this course is going to be based on these four things: the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then the principle of non-repudiation. And again, non-repudiation is that if that activity performed on the network cannot be denied. Um, so those are, again, kind of the foundational things. And you'll see these terms are going to be referred to quite a bit throughout the course. And you'll also see it, on the exam as well. Matter of fact, and this is, I will point out as we go through here, I'll try to point out, like what you would actually see in the real world versus what's in the book kind of thing. Because, sometimes those two things can be a little bit different. And so the way I typically describe that is I'll say the practical application of this, that from a practical perspective, or in the real world, these terms are used. When my ISO and I have conversations, we're using these terms. When we're meeting as an IT department, these terms are in there. Okay, so this is not only something that you need to know for the course and for the exam, but from a practical sense as well. This is terminology that you would actually use. When you're looking at trying to establish a security, strategy or anything like that for your network, it's always nice. I was just asked a question while I'll be sharing any important notes in the chat. Yeah, when I come across different links, like for example, looking at the NIST, the 5 functions, here's the link for that. So yeah, whoops, I sent that as a direct message. As I run across things, I will be sharing links in the chat. So pretty much only links though. If I run across something, I'll put it there. So make sure you're checking out the chat, or at least before you leave tonight, that you take a look and see what was there. But if you're ever tasked with coming up with a security strategy for, my pleasure, for a company, for a network, it's always useful to have kind of some sort of checklist or guideline, a place to start. And this is where different frameworks come into play. Now, we're going to talk about frameworks in a couple of different contexts in this course. And the framework that is mentioned here is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and this is a government agency, and its job is to come up with the different standards for, as the name would imply, different kinds of technologies. That includes networks and security, cybersecurity. And the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is an extremely important, document that NIST, or standard that NIST has come up with. And in this context, when we talk about a framework, it's kind of like a checklist or a series of objectives and goals. Okay, so in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, there are 5 different functions that are outlined, and for each one of those, you would have different objectives. In order for you to, implement the function of identify, well, here are the different things that they believe you should have in place in order for you to meet that function of the framework. Now, the 5 functions that you see here in the diagram, in the slide, the first function is identify. So when we look at our role in cybersecurity, one of the functions of our job is to identify the threats. The identify function is basically coming up with what threats exist, doing some sort of risk management or threat assessment, and then developing the policies, the procedures, implementing the systems that you need in order for you to try to mitigate those risks, try to patch those vulnerabilities, that kind of thing. That's the identify function as outlined in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And just so you know, the NIST CSF is Cybersecurity Framework is a very widely used, widely adopted framework. Everybody uses this, okay? So, I mean, there are even products like our disaster recovery solution that we're using for all of our backups and everything. One of the things that really got our attention when we were looking at the product was you pull up their documentation, and the very first thing they put is, here's the NIST cybersecurity framework, and here's how we designed our product around that. That was huge for us because that showed us that this particular vendor has security in mind from the very beginning. And so that was a real good selling point for us. So the NIST cybersecurity framework, very, very widely implemented, and you see it referred to a lot in the industry. Once we've identified the different threats, we put systems in place and that sort of thing. The next step is protect. And this is going to be an ongoing thing. Okay. Actually, all of these are ongoing, but identifying is, like I said, you do your risk assessments, you do your, vulnerability assessments, things like that. And you identify what's out there and what you need to protect. The protect function is where you actually do the implementation. Okay, and I will put the IPS in place. I will put the firewalls in place. I will write identify probably the policies and procedures are more on the identify side, but either way, protecting is where we're actually getting to the meat of everything, getting things in place to protect the network against those vulnerabilities and threats that we've identified. Detect, the detect function is next. So we have identify, we have protect, and then we have detect. So this is 1, 2, and then 3. So the detect function is where you basically monitor the network. You should have different systems on the network that are continually monitoring and evaluating activity, so that way you can determine if there's some sort of potential security event that's occurring or has occurred. Okay, and so that's going to be the detect. You need to make sure that these systems are in place, that they are updated and maintained, so that way they continue to be effective. If something happens, if there is some sort of event that occurs, step 4 is going to be to respond. And we're going to look at incident response next week. But again, this is where we go through and identify the actual security incident that's occurred. We try to contain it. We do the eradication of it. And then we do the recovery, which is the next step. Once I've responded to a threat and I've been able to eradicate it, then I go through and I do the recovery. That's going to be the 5th function. And this is where you take systems that were compromised and you get them in a state where they can be deployed back into the network in a safe fashion and without introducing any more risk. Now, we're going to talk about frameworks at a couple of different points in this class. The NIST cybersecurity framework is a big one, though. Now, I don't recall actually seeing this on my exam, and I don't really remember seeing it on any practice exams that I took. However, this is a common body of knowledge, and it is, like I said, something that you do need to be familiar with. And I'd recommend, as part of your preparation, take a look at the website there, the link that I put into the chat, and take a look at NIST site and the cybersecurity framework, and I would get familiar with it, because again, it is something that is widely used in the industry. It's a kind of an industry standard thing. As far as what you can expect to do in a cybersecurity role, it could be a lot of different things. Typically, you're going to be involved in depends on what job you're in, and depends on the size of the organization. If you're in a really, really large company or organization, if it's a government agency or whatever, you tend to have some very specific job functions and job titles. The smaller the company is, the more general your job becomes, because there aren't as many resources. And so you end up having to wear a lot of hats, and that's just part of it. There are advantages and disadvantages to both, scenarios. Personally, I prefer being in a smaller company simply because I like the challenge and I find it more interesting to have a lot more or a lot, of different things to do. Um, but again, there are advantages to being in a large company versus a small company. It just depends on what you prefer. Some of the things that you might get pulled into risk assessment and testing. If you have an internal auditing person or internal auditing department, in a company, then you might be brought in to look at the technical aspects of their risk assessment and to do some risk testing and that sort of thing. And we're going to look at risk assessments next week. A lot of times you'll be involved in specifying, and here specifying, sourcing, installing, configuring. What you do there is going to vary, but you're probably going to be involved at some level with security software and security hardware. It may be that you're making a recommendation. It could be that you're doing testing and, hey, we just got a trial version of this particular software, so let's go and see how it works, that kind of thing. You may be the person actually implementing it, or you may be the person that comes afterwards and you audit to make sure that it was done correctly and to make sure that all of the different security requirements were met. You may also be called on to access user privileges and permissions. This is actually something that we're going through right now. It's like, okay, I told our ISO, I was like, Josh, we need to go through and we need to do an audit on all of our servers. We need to figure out, we need to look at all of our user groups, like how many members do we have in the administrators group in the domain, and are they all supposed to be there? What can we get rid of? Is there any way we need to tighten up our permissions and our privileges? And so that's a process that we're going through right now. Part of this could involve auditing events and looking at log files. Now, typically, you're going to have some sort of system on your network, and we'll look at this next week when we look at security appliances. I guess that'll be on Saturday, and we'll talk about a SIEM, SIEM, a security information and events monitoring system. And this is a system that will collect information from across the network, put it into a central location, and allow you to do analytics against it. Okay. And that tends to be what you're going to see. So when you start looking at auditing logs and events, hopefully there's some sort of central log collection that is doing that and allows you to see things in a central location. Incident reporting and response, regardless of what's going on, typically if there's any kind of security incident, we're going to be pulling somebody from security in there to actually write the incident report. This happened for us a few weeks ago. Some idiot in our department, total bonehead, which was me, of course. I made a change on one of our production servers. I put our disaster recovery software on there, and I didn't do a snapshot first, and our server tanked. And so me and two of my guys ended up spending all night on a Sunday getting the server back online. Okay, well, even though it wasn't a security incident per se, we still had our ISO come in and do the incident response and write the report, simply because there could be security implications there, and we want to make sure that we're doing things the right way. So, that kind of stuff can happen. Security people tend to be involved at some level with business continuity and disaster recovery. So maybe not necessarily coming up with the backup schedule or something like that. However, maybe giving some feedback as to how the system is designed. Like, for example, we're storing all of our backups over in this location, whatever that location is. How are we protecting that against ransomware? Is the data stream encrypted? Are the backups encrypted at rest? Things like that is typically where a security person is going to come in and give some recommendations on that sort of thing. And then also security training and education programs. One of the things that you'll hear me say quite a bit throughout this course is that uneducated end users are one of the biggest threats that you will have on your network. An uneducated end user is a huge threat. You want to make sure that your end users are well educated. They need to know what social engineering techniques are out there. They need to know how to respond to those. They need to know just basic cybersecurity awareness. So, developing a training and education program is a big deal. And that's something that, security people are going to be involved in. And we're actually going through that as well right now. We're just kicking off our cybersecurity awareness training. We actually decided we were going to write our own, and then we decided that that would suck, and so we started looking at outsourcing it. And I just put a link in the chat. This is the product we decided to go with, and they've got a real exhaustive library of training, phishing campaigns, and things like that. We also looked at Phishing Box was another one, but KnowBe4 really impressed us. So if you want to take a look and kind of get familiar with what a cybersecurity training program would look like, you can take a look at that. But in in an information security role, these are the types of tasks that you might be given. They might be asking for your input at the very least on some of these things, and which is good. It allows, anytime that we can get more exposed to different topics, the better off we're going to be. And so anytime you can get pulled into any of these directions, you definitely want to. So that way, again, just picking up experience, more education, and really understanding the job a lot better. As far as the different roles and responsibilities that you're going to find in an information security, kind of environment, at the top level, you're going to have an executive of some sort who is ultimately responsible for the security of the organization. For my company, it's probably me or my boss. So my boss, I report to the CEO, and the CEO is right now he's the acting CTO, or Chief Technical Officer, and hopefully that's a position I'll get to move into. That's what he and I have talked about. But anyway, typically the person who is ultimately responsible for security is going to be at a C level. It could be the Chief Technical Officer, a CTO, or it could be a Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO. That kind of role is going to take a lot of experience. You're going to have certifications, a Security Plus at the minimum, probably a CISSP if you want to move into a CISO kind of role, and you're going to have to be able to manage people as well. It's a difficult role. That's one of the more difficult roles in a company. It's a highly political role. As a CISO, your job is to basically a CISSP. I'll give you a link for it. It's CISSP. So ICS squared is, or ICS2 is an organization. They put out a couple of security certifications, and CISSP is kind of the flagship. And this is the Certified Information System Security Professional. And one of the things that I mentioned when we were first talking about this, introducing this course, a lot of the material that we are talking about in this course also applies to the CISSP exam. So it's, staying up with this material, you could actually leverage, taking this exam and passing it, you can actually kind of leverage that into preparing for the CISSP as well. CISSP is a kind of the flagship certification, and it's a really good one. I would recommend that you guys read up on it. It does have some, once you take the exam and you pass it, then you go through a process of becoming certified where you actually have to prove that you have on-the-job experience. However, there are a couple of levels there. So you can take the exam, be an associate member until you get the amount of experience you need, and then get the certification at that point. But if you're looking at doing cybersecurity, the CISSP, I think, would be your next step as far as, or at least your next big goal after Security Plus. Security Plus is the perfect place to start. But CISSP is something that you definitely want to look into. And that's one of those things where if you want to get into security management and you want to move up into, again, more of a leadership role, a CISSP is going to help you with that because it really does solidify your credentials. You know, it's a good one to have.
Hey, Joseph, I got a question.
Sure.
Hey, so with these certs, are certs usually going to be more valuable in the cybersecurity world, or do you need to also like your degree to back that up as well? From your experience and knowledge, I should say.
Yeah, I'll give you my completely biased opinion. So now keep in mind, this is a lot of this is my personal opinion, and a lot of this, well, quite a bit of this is also my experience and kind of what I've seen in the industry. Most of the time, all right, if I'm hiring you in my department, if my boss, our CEO, is hiring you, we don't care if you have a degree. If you have a degree, that's great. And there are companies out there where having a degree is a basic litmus test. You know, either, you know, as a requirement for this job, you must have a degree. And so in a case like that, obviously having a degree is a good thing. In a small company like ours, me running my own business for 20 years, I couldn't care less about a degree. When what I'm looking for is if it's an entry level position, having a certification sets you apart from everybody else because everybody in their job wants to be a whatever network administrator, cybersecurity analyst, you know, pick a position.
Gotcha.
It's competitive. Having that certification means that I will actually look at your resume and I'll actually talk to you.
Okay, yeah, because I've got a couple people that I've talked to, friends that I went to college with and stuff like that, and they've got their degrees in other fields, but they've gotten cybersecurity certs, I should say, and they just, I guess, when people hire cybersecurity individuals, they want to know if you can do the job, and basically that you have the certs to prove that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, here where you guys really well, so I'm in Colorado Springs. A lot of you guys are in San Antonio. And Dallas, I know that you've got there's a Naval Air Station there in Fort Worth. Is there a big military presence in DFW?
Yeah, there's a pretty big one.
Okay. If you're well, Texas in and of itself is a very military friendly place. Being in Colorado Springs is very, very military friendly because we have 47 military bases. You know, I mean, I think we have 5 bases here. And so, so very, very pro military. And you have a lot of defense contracting positions here, San Antonio, and in places like that. So, like, again, speaking from my experience, if I look at you guys, I see prior military, that's automatically a plus sign for us. If we see now for us, security clearances, yeah, private sector, unless you're doing DoD stuff, government stuff, security clearances are not a big deal for the private sector. But prior military is going to be a plus. And then the fact that you actually have the certification, that automatically just makes us go, huh, I want to talk to the guy. And now I will tell you that if I see that you have a certification, when you interview, I'm going to test you a little bit on that. And I mean, it's not going to be like a quiz, but I'm going to throw some stuff at you and see if it was just a piece of paper or if you actually absorb the material. Can you really, do you know the terminology? Can you apply
Gotcha.
it? And what we'll see in a situation like that is as much your attitude and how you handle those kinds of questions, that is going to be at least as important as what the actual answer you give us.
Gotcha.
But yeah, the certifications, a degree is not really going to make us go, let's put this person's resume at the top of the pile.
Gotcha.
If you're still learning, then be honest about it. Hey, I'm still learning. I'm looking for an entry level job. I'm excited about this. I've taken all of these classes because I really want to be prepared. I really want to excel at what I'm doing. I'm planning on taking the certification exams here, here, and here. And, be upfront and honest. And again, guys like me, I would much rather have somebody who, I mean, you've got to have a basic aptitude, obviously, but I would rather have somebody who is eager and has a good work ethic and who has integrity, because I can't teach any of those things. I can teach the IT stuff all day long, but I can't teach how to work hard and I can't teach you how not to be dishonest. You know, so the positive attitude, that kind of stuff, it's hard to put a price tag on that. But be honest, be eager, and then be open. It could be that I really want to get that cybersecurity position, but they're going to put me on a tier one help desk where I'm answering the phone, helping people reset their password. Okay, great. That's where most of us started. So hope does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay, good, good.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I can't even begin. Attitude is everything. It is very discouraging, some of the people that we've interviewed, and just the attitude. It seems like in a certain, I'm going to sound extremely old when I say this, but there's a certain generational gap somewhere that's occurred where the attitude changed from, I'm really excited about the opportunity and grateful that you are taking a chance on me. And somehow that attitude changed into, boy, you're really lucky that I'm even showing up and I deserve a job. It's like there's a shift that occurred there. And it's been pretty depressing. But yeah, attitude is everything. I will tell you this: our core culture of our entire company can be summed up in two sentences: have good intentions, be a good teammate. And if you think about it, those two things encompass pretty much everything about a good attitude at a company. Have good intentions and be a good teammate. And if those two things are kind of what you live by, then you're going to fit into any organization. So as you're doing your interviews and everything, think about what kind of core values do you have along those lines of what is important to you to be in a company. What are you going to be able to contribute to the culture of the organization? And if you can communicate that during a job interview, that'll help you out a lot as well. That'll help you out a lot. Like I said, attitude is everything. So anyway, sorry, I don't mean to get on a soapbox. Hopefully, if I give you guys information like that, you'll find it valuable. If you find that I'm going too far off topic, shoot me a message in chat and I'll get back on track. But well, good. I'm glad. But yeah, those types of things are a big deal. And I will tell you this: cybersecurity is not going anywhere. If anything, it is becoming more and more important. So everybody is familiar with the Colonial Pipeline hack. Kaseya just got hacked. Kaseya is one of the largest MSP software providers in the world. MSP being a managed service provider. So that's a company that like small companies outsource IT to, you know. Kaseya got hacked. SolarWinds got hacked in December. 310,000 customers were impacted, including NASA, Microsoft, all parts of Department of Defense, and all kinds of things. Big, big deal. The Massachusetts not the Mass Transit Authority, because that would be the subways, but the ferry, I can't remember the name of it, but they just got hacked last week, shut down some of their stuff. JBS, which is the second largest food processor in maybe the world, I don't know, but their Australian and North American meat processing plants all were shut down at the beginning of last month due to ransomware. I mean, this stuff, it's yeah, top 3 in meat production. They're huge. Anyway, you know, they got hit. And then, you know, the White House, we went to Russia. And it's funny because, and we're not going to get into politics, but this was one of those things where you just kind of shake your head. You know, we went to Russia and told them, here are the 16 things that you're not allowed to hack, which from a security standpoint, we're looking at it going, so you just went to Russia and said, here are the 16 most valuable targets, and then everything else is okay because we're not going to do anything about it. Just, you know, don't understand it, but it's one of those things where we're going to see an increase in this kind of stuff. So getting into cybersecurity now, we're going to see the field grow and grow and grow. So it's going to be a real good thing, a real good thing. Well, it's not good for everybody else. It's good for us though, because, you know, we get to benefit from it. But anyway, going back within the organization, like I said, ultimately you're going to have, yeah, there is a lot of job security. It's not going anywhere. And it's pretty interesting stuff, you know, but your CISO is going to be the person in charge. That's going to be your executive level. And then, you know, depending on the size of the organization, you may have different, you know, security managers. Like this person's in charge of physical security, you know, so the building and that kind of stuff, facilities, that sort of thing. Somebody else may be responsible for financial audits, like if you're a bank or, you know, a financial organization. So you could have different middle management kind of stuff there. And then you have your technical staff. This tends to be where your information security officers are. And by the way, if you look, so you've got on the slide there, you've got CSO and CISO, Chief Security Officer, Chief Information Security Officer. Same thing, just two different titles for the same position. Same thing with ISSO or ISO. You're either going to have an information system security officer or an information security officer. My experience is that ISO is a little bit more common, but again, same job, just different titles. Also, we'll have non-technical staff that's involved with security. This could be HR people. These could be people that are looking at policy and compliance, that sort of thing, not necessarily looking at anything technical. And then there are other, you know, responsibilities with security that will lie outside of the department. This is where, you know, we have, you know, due diligence and due care. In other words, what we're saying is that security goes beyond the security department. Everybody is responsible for cybersecurity. At some level, everybody is responsible, each person individually. We all have to maintain our own systems as far as how we use them every day. And we all have to, you know, make sure that we are following the appropriate security policies that have been put in place, so that way we keep our network secure. So security goes way beyond just the cybersecurity department or the IT department. It impacts everybody. And hopefully you have an executive staff who's on board with that. And we're very, very fortunate in that we do. From the CEO down, we're very, very security centric, which is very, very nice. As far as different departments or business units that you might see in a company, you might, if it's a very large company, you might have a security operations center or SOC. This would be a kind of a central place where all the security people are. You know, there's a picture of the IBM SOC in Cambridge, and you know, this is, you know, where everybody kind of gathers and they look at what's going on for the company. Now, something like this is going to be fairly rare in the private sector, unless you're in a very, very large company, or if you're like in, you know, well, it'd have to be a large company. You know, you would have a lot of IT resources out there. It might be financial, it could be healthcare, you know, something like that. But as far as in a small company, you're not going to see, you know, this kind of setup, just because it's extremely expensive to set up and maintain. Um, there is a position, or this bullet point here, DevSecOps. So we're going to talk about this more when we get into the lesson next week on application security concepts. But so if you're in a company that develops software of any kind, like the company I work for, you have a position known as DevOps. Okay, and DevOps stands for development and operations. So development is where the developers are writing code. Operations is where the code gets pushed into production, whatever that looks like. So it's now downloadable by customers, it's on the website, whatever production means for the company. A DevOps person, their job is to kind of be the liaison between development and operations. So they're working with the developers, working with IT to ensure that code gets pushed correctly, efficiently, and that sort of thing. DevSecOps is now kind of putting security in the middle of that. Okay. In this particular case, we're talking about making security basically part of your culture. That DevSecOps, from the time the software is in its conception of being designed until the time where it's actually published and it's out there in production, we are looking at security every step of the way. And we'll get more into this when we get into the lesson on application security concepts and kind of what you can expect to see as you interact with, you know, developers and with IT. Incident response. Again, this is going to vary widely based on the organization that you're in and the size of it. The incident response team, and you see there are 3 different acronyms there. You have the cyber incident response team, computer security incident response team, computer emergency response team, computer incident response team, security incident response team, on and on and on. Lots of different acronyms. We're all talking about the exact same thing, which is a group of people whose job it is to respond to security events that have occurred. This could be anything from a phishing email that somebody received to ransomware running rampant on the network. The incident response team is going to be responsible for going through the response procedures and ensuring that the threat is identified, that it is contained, that it's eradicated, and that recovery can occur. So that's what the incident response team does. Again, as far as what an incident response team looks like, that's going to vary. In a large company, you might have, you know, an entire department or team that's what they do is incident response. In a small company, it may be the IT department or could be outsourced. You know, you never know. But again, what you see there can vary based on the size of the company and the kind of resources, you know, that it has. But any questions so far over anything we've talked about?
No, sir.
Yeah, forgive me. I have to keep drinking stuff to keep things going. So when you look at the labs, and the labs should be on the again on your ACI Learning homepage where you got into this course and then got into Zoom and all of that. There is a lab called Exploring the Lab Environment. It's Lab 1. You guys have already been through these courses. You should already be familiar with kind of what this lab's going to show you. It's worth doing because it's going to show you the different systems that exist for this environment. So like you have a Kali Linux, system, you've got, some other stuff out there. So taking a look at the lab environment, how it's set up, it's not a bad idea. So I'd recommend that you take a look at that. Other than that, we're going to move forward and look at different types of controls, the different categories, and that sort of thing, and then move on from there. When you look at implementing security on your network, you have what's known as security controls. Okay. Now, this all goes back to the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Everything that we do from a security perspective is going to support one of those three principles. And then the fourth principle was the one of non-repudiation. Non-repudiation being that a user is not able to deny their actions on the network. We can always track an activity back to the user, and the user cannot deny having done it. That's non-repudiation. In order for us to do this, we have to put different controls in place. And there are three categories of controls. Okay. You have managerial controls, you have operational controls, and you have technical controls. So let's say that we have so let's say that we've got a folder on the network, and this folder has files in it, and we're going to give people access to those you know to those files, to those resources. A managerial control would be something that gives me like oversight. Okay, this could be something like a policy. Okay, the policy says that we're going to do control. We're going to do security this way. Okay, the managerial control would be a risk assessment that would tell us the potential risk of that data being breached and how we can mitigate the risk, that sort of thing. The operational control would be the people, the IT people, who actually go in and they put the different permissions in place on that particular resource. And then the technical control would be the access control list that is on the folder that specifies this person can do this person can do that. So when you look at the different categories of controls, they kind of run the gamut here. And for the exam, it's good to be able to identify these things where you get a scenario, like a 1 or 2 sentence scenario, that so-and-so has, this folder, they're trying to do this. What category or what type of control would this be? And you would have managerial, operational, technical, and maybe some other word that's not really, it sounds good, but doesn't apply, that kind of thing. So being able to identify these categories is a good thing. Make sure you come back and review this. That said, it is just after the top of the hour, so need to go ahead and take a break. It is just a minute past 8 o'clock Central. Let's take a break till 10 after. That gives us 9 minutes, and then we'll pick up from here. Let's go ahead and take a break. So picking up where we left off, again, looking at the different types or categories of security controls, managerial controls, you know, are controls that, well, like it says, it gives oversight of the system. So like, for example, we have a policy that says that certain access is granted to certain individuals for particular data or whatever. That would be managerial. It's a policy. Then you have the operational controls. These are the people that actually implement a control. And then the technical control. This would be the actual part of the operating system or hardware or whatever. It would be, going on the firewall and implementing the access control list for the traffic. That's a technical control. Going to the folder and setting the permissions on the ACL there. That would be a technical control. Now, on top of that, we also have different functional types of controls. So, for example, you have preventive controls. A preventive control is one that operates before an attack happens, and the point of it is to prevent the attack from taking place. So, like on a firewall, it could be the access control list. So, what a firewall does, its job is to control traffic moving between security zones. So, like the internet would be one security zone, and then my internal network would be another security zone, and the firewall sits between the two and controls traffic that goes in, back and forth. Okay, that access control list where the firewall, where it specifies what the firewall will allow and what it will block. That's an example of a preventive control. It acts prior to an event to try to keep the event from occurring. A detective control is one that is operating during a security event. And its job is to basically identify that a security event is occurring and typically log it, record it some way. Hopefully, it will do some sort of alerting, as well. But example there, again, log files, as things are happening, they get logged, and those logs are going to be detective controls. They are operating while a security event is taking place, and they are simply detecting it. They're identifying the information. And then corrective controls are those that operate after an attack. And a corrective control would be one that tries to put things back the way they were. So an example of this would be, let's say, ransomware. Ransomware is kind of the thing that keeps guys like me up at night. Ransomware is terrifying because if it strikes, you could literally, and as we go, when we get to that part of the class, I'll relate to you. I've had a couple of experiences with ransomware, and they're not good. But ransomware, you could suffer 100% data loss if you get hit with that kind of attack. In that, if we're looking at that, a preventive control, there could be a couple. One could be having a good endpoint detection and response system, EDR, previously known as antivirus. Traditional antivirus is not really enough anymore. You need something that's a little bit more advanced, and that's where an EDR comes into play. And we'll talk about that more later in the class. But a preventive control would be something on the endpoint that detects those types of events and then, can respond to them, okay? Or can keep it from happening to begin with, that would be a preventive control. Let's say that the ransomware hits though, let's say that it starts going. Well, you should have activity in your log files that will tell you that, look, this is happening, and alerts should be raised that this is going on. And then a corrective control might be you have an EDR that will actually roll back changes. And so the files that get encrypted, it will actually roll that back with the versions of the files that existed prior to the encryption or something of that nature. That would be an example of a corrective control. Or it may be that I just had to recover from tape, from backups. Okay, not necessarily tape, but I had backups, I had to recover from backup. That could be the corrective control that's in place. But preventive or before the attack, try to keep it from happening. Detective controls are during the attack and they report on the activity. And then corrective controls occur after the fact and are used to put things back the way they're supposed to be, and hopefully prevent it from happening again in the future. Let's see, other types that you have. You have physical controls. These would be things like, doors, windows, alarms, turnstiles, man traps, things of that nature. It could be a cable lock that you put on your laptop. That's a physical control. A deterrent is a control that may not, it doesn't necessarily, like it says on the slide, it may not physically or logically, being like an access list, it may not prevent access, but it discourages. It's more of a psychological thing. Okay, this could be something like a sign that says authorized personnel only. No trespassing violators will be prosecuted. Or, being in Texas, just shot, whatever. I mentioned I'm from Texas. I grew up in Bernie, outside San Antonio, and I went to Texas A&M. And anyway, I love Texas. But did you guys hear on the news I think it was last week, the couple in Houston, that there was like a peeping Tom looking in their 10-year-old daughter's bedroom. So the mom and dad got their guns, held him at gunpoint until the police got there. But when the guy tried to wrestle the gun away from the woman, the dad shot him 4 times. And being in Colorado, it's like, I don't know, it's kind of a different culture. But I was trying to explain to them in Texas the way that the interview with the police officer would have been kind of like, okay, so let's see, you saw him looking in your daughter's bedroom and you shot him. All right, well, I guess we're done here. Here's my card if you need anything, and we'll go get some ammunition for you to replenish those 4 rounds that you shot. Anyway, different world in Texas. We're actually looking to move back there next summer, and I can't wait. I love the culture there. Anyway, sorry. And those of you who are law enforcement, I know that's not what you do. Anyway, but deterrents are, a sign. One of the most effective things that people do is they put a sign on their window that says protected by ADT or whatever security company. Having that sign up on the window is a psychological deterrent. It's a deterrent for intrusion, and that's the kind of control that would be. A compensating control is one that either substitutes or enhances or contributes to an existing control. So here's an example. We're going to talk a lot about Windows networks in this class, and the reason why is because that really in the business world, pretty much everything is a Windows network. I mean, you may have Macs on the network, you may have Linux, but you're pretty much in a Windows environment as far as from a networking standpoint. That's not always the case, but that is the majority of the time. And also in these courses, I don't know if you noticed, Cisco comes up a lot. Cisco is talked about a lot in the CompTIA courses, and the reason why is because that's really the majority of the hardware that's out there, and so that's why you'll see that. But like in a Windows environment, the security infrastructure is called Active Directory. And when we look at, you guys should have talked about Kerberos and single sign-on and Network Plus, where you have the key distribution center, the ticket granting tickets, and the service tickets and that sort of thing. In Windows, that implementation is known as Active Directory. In Active Directory, you can centrally control credentials and passwords through group policy. And you can do things like enforce password complexity. When you enforce password complexity in group policy, it's just a checkbox where it says require complex passwords. You put a check in the box and you're done. And what that does for you is whenever a user changes their password, they have to satisfy 3 of 4 requirements: uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and special characters. They've got to do at least 3 of those. Now, that's fine. However, let's say that you are a bank and you've got other regulatory compliance requirements. FFIEC guidelines say that you actually have to have a password that meets different requirements than just what Windows will do. There is third-party software that you can purchase and install on your network, which will actually enforce a different password policy than what you can do natively in Active Directory. So I'm basically getting a third-party plugin, in essence, and putting that control in place to compensate for the control that is there already. And it enhances the functionality and allows me to, to have more granular control over the password complexity. That's an example of a compensating control. The existing control doesn't quite meet our requirements, so we'll put something else in place to enhance it, to basically compensate. That's going to be a compensating control. And that's a term that you need to be aware of. And I just saw in chat, Kent, I got your message. I got to update attendance here real quick. So we talked about frameworks, and a framework is kind of like a checklist. Okay, a framework is a series of tasks, objectives, things like that that you can use to determine where you're at in your, your security, I guess, your security posture. Okay, a framework is a good starting point. Give me just a moment here. Did I get? Okay, I got that. So when we're looking at a framework, let's say, like I said before, you've been tasked with making sure that, and this is a real common thing to hear, I need you to make sure our network is secure. Okay, what does that mean? That can mean anything. So where do you start? Where do I go to get, basically a list of what I need to do? And that's where a framework is going to come into play. A framework in this context is basically a series of tasks or objectives, okay, that you can use as benchmarks for knowing where you're at as far as whoops, that's not the right, hold on. That's the CISSP link, sorry. This is the overall link for the cybersecurity framework from NIST. And like I said before, this is the one that pretty much everybody uses. This gives you a set of objectives. Where are we when it comes to security? Well, I can load the framework, look at all of the different tasks and objectives, and see, do I meet those objectives? And if not, then now I've got some sort of measuring stick that I can use for measuring my progress. Okay, the cybersecurity framework is basically just a set of tasks and objectives for how you can make your network more secure. For example, it might have a section on identity management and access control. Okay, great. Or, I guess it'd be identity management and authentication would be a better way of saying it. Cool. Yeah, everybody take a look at the chat. Looks like Joshua lost his laptop, so he's on his phone. So again, yeah, throw resources into the Discord if you could. Um, but anyway, the cybersecurity framework or any framework like that is going to be, like I said, hey, how do we know we're secure? Well, if I look at the identity management and authentication objective of the NIST cybersecurity framework, it lists 14 things that I should have configured on my network in that particular function. Okay, well, have I done that? Have I enabled password complexity? Have I enabled password expiration? And so on and so forth. Okay, so a framework will allow you to do that. It gives you a measuring stick of where you're at, and it gives you a goal of where you need to be. And then your strategy is going to be, how do we get from point A to point B? That's my security strategy. Now, NIST has put out other frameworks as well. You have the risk management framework as mentioned here. That's something that typically you're only going to see used in the government. We don't really need to worry about that. And then FIPS, the Federal Information Processing Standards. These are standards that are put out by NIST, which apply to software, and software that is doing specific security related functions, like maybe password management, or it is doing encryption or something like that. The FIPS standards that are put out by NIST, if you want your software to be FIPS compliant, then you hire a consultant that goes through the process with you. It's a very expensive process. We're actually finalizing our FIPS certification right now for one of our technologies, but you go through the different processes, you submit all of this stuff to NIST, they go through it and they make sure that all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and if you meet all of the requirements, then they will give you that certification. It will, if you're going to do that, expect to spend $50,000 to $100,000 minimum getting your per piece of software to get some sort of FIPS compliant certification. It's very, very expensive, but it's if you need it, it's worth it. You also have what's known as the NIST special publications, and these will be designated as SP followed by a number. Like, for example, if you want to do business with the Department of Defense and you want to be a contractor, then you're going to have to meet NIST 800-171 standards. 800-171 is the designator for a special publication. It's special publication 800-171. So you'll hear it referred to a lot as NIST 800-171 or one of the others. And again, that is the designation of the special publication. And the special publication is going to be some sort of standard that NIST has put out for a particular specific industry or certification or requirement or something like that. The NIST cybersecurity framework, you really need to be familiar with that. There are other frameworks out there as well. These are not nearly as prevalent, especially in small to medium-sized companies. But the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, they've put out the 27,000 series or 27K series of standards, which all have to do with information security. And then you have the 31,000 series or 31K, which has to do with risk management. The big difference, one of the big differences between the ISO frameworks and the cybersecurity framework is put out by the government and by NIST, and it's free. You can go download it. The ISO standards you actually have to pay for. You have to pay for the frameworks, and then if you want to get some sort of ISO certification, you can go through those processes. You can go through those processes with them and become ISO 27001 certified or whatever. You also have the Cloud Security Alliance. They're a nonprofit that puts out security docs for CSPs, a cloud service provider. This is for somebody like an Amazon or AWS or Microsoft's Azure or Oracle's cloud solution or Google Cloud or whatever. If you're going to be a cloud security provider, The Cloud Security Alliance has resources to help you, design your network, that sort of thing. That's something that most of us would never run across because most of us are not going to be designing or developing a cloud solution. As far as the exam goes, I be familiar with these organizations and like be familiar with the 27K and 31K designations for ISO, that the 27,000 series of frameworks are for information security. The 31,000 is risk management. I don't really think you need to worry too much more about it than that. Cloud Security Alliance, I didn't see it. Nobody's told me that they have, but again, just be familiar with who they are and what they do. I don't think you really need to dive into the weeds there. When it comes to the SSAE SOC evaluations and standards, these are important, and you run across these all the time. Let's say that you decide to open a data center, and this data center is going to be used for people to co-locate equipment so they can like rent a cabinet from you and put their servers in there, that sort of thing. And so that's where their environment is. If you're that kind of service provider, and there are other kinds as well, but something like that, if you're any kind of hosted environment, any kind of co-location, something like that, there is a standard that that you need to comply with that governs how you do business and how you manage your environment. You have the American Institute of CPAs, Certified Public Accountants, the AICPA. They have come out with these audit specifications called the Statements on Standards for Attestation Engagements, SSAE. I don't know if you need to know what SSAE stands for, but you do see the acronym, as part of the service level agreements that you get from your providers. But the SSAE specifications, the current specification is SSAE number 18, that's current. But this goes through and it identifies the different types of controls that a service provider needs to have in place. And in order for you to be compliant, you would have to go through an audit, an SSAE, a SOC audit, a SOC 2 audit. And this is where an auditor comes in. They look at how you have set up your environment, how you manage your environment, and basically how you do business. They're going to look at all of your, they're going to have what's known as trust services criteria, where they look at, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. They also look at data privacy, like private information. And when we talk about private information or personally identifiable information, we're talking about things like social security numbers and driver's license and, date of birth, things like that, things that can identify an individual, either identify them or their location. That's what we mean by confidential or private data. So they're going to look at all of those things. They're going to look at how everything is documented, how you track changes, like if you have a ticketing system, what your change management policy is, all of that kind of stuff. And they're going to go through and do a type 1 report. And the type 1 report is going to assess and audit all of those different things for the organization. 6 to 12 months later, they're going to come back and do the type 2 audit. And that's where they go through and check and make sure that everything you're doing matches what your policies had laid out and that you're consistently doing this over time. Whenever, as part of your due diligence, when selecting a vendor, if you're going to do some sort of co-location or something like that, you have a hosting provider, part of your due diligence is going to be to get a SOC 2 report from the provider. And it's going to be the audit that will specify all of, everything that they do and the fact that somebody has signed off on it. These audits are very expensive. They are very, very resource intensive. But if you're going to be a provider, they're also necessary. It's something that you just simply are going to have to do. For the exam, be familiar with a SOC 2 report, type 1 and type 2. Be familiar with the terminology and really what they mean. And I saw that on my exam, and I've had other people, tell me that they've seen it as well. There are some other resources out there, other things to look at. You have benchmarks and different guides for how to configure different things. You have the Center for Internet Security. They put out their top 20 CIS, the 20 CIS controls is what they call it. And they've also got the risk management and things like that. I'll throw a link into the chat for you. The CIS, the Center for Internet Security Controls, are basically just their list of the things that you should always have in place. It's a good resource. Also, keep in mind that you've got different, for each system, you've got the vendor. Like, let's say I've got a Cisco firewall. Cisco is going to put out all kinds of guides and templates and best practices for how you should configure their stuff. Okay, and CIS will also put out benchmarks, and the benchmark again is going to be, here's your baseline, this is where your configuration should begin, that kind of thing. DoD puts out the STIGs, the Security Technical Implementation Guides. This is another really good resource, and a lot of times you will hear people refer to STIGs. Well, according to the STIG, you're supposed to do this. That's something you'll hear commonly. Okay, that's at public.cyber.mil. I put the link into the chat, and this is where, if I'm implementing, I don't know, a particular type of switch or router, operating system, or whatever, I can go and find the STIG for how that should be configured. What does the DoD recommend for how you configure those devices? And then you also have NIST has put out their national checklist program, which gives you similar information. So there's a lot of stuff out there that you can utilize to help secure your environment, to go back and look at all of the different operating systems and devices you have on your network and ensure that you're configuring them to best practices. And if you do that, it goes a long way towards securing your network. You also want to make sure you understand the kinds of applications you have on the network. A lot of applications are going to be client server apps, meaning that you have a client, something that's running, on a desktop operating system or something like that. And then you have the server, and that is the part of the application that resides on a server and is giving access to data and that sort of thing. These types of architectures are very common, and we're going to talk more about this when we get into the secure application concepts next week. So we'll end up talking a lot more about web application servers and other application servers and things like that. Any questions over any, one more, sorry, got ahead of myself. Regulation, standards, and legislation. Depending upon the industry that you are in, you might have regulatory compliance requirements. And what I mean by that is there could be laws that govern how your company does business. And in that case, there will be requirements that you'll have to meet in order to be compliant with the law, with those regulations. A lot of these are going to apply to the financial sector, in the fintech space, that kind of thing. Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX. This is primarily for financial organizations. It's a risk management and auditing standard that you have to meet. Computer Security Act of '87 that's when the federal government, Congress passed a law that says that government computers actually have to have, security policies. And then FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act. This is, if you're a government agency, it dictates how you handle data processing. Those are things we tend to not really have to worry too much about in the private sector. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, we'll talk more about this when we get into data privacy next week. But this is a law that was put in place by the European Union. And if you're a member country or if you have customers that are in the EU or you have data that's in the EU, like a data processing center or something like that, then you'll fall under GDPR jurisdiction. So this will govern how you can use consumer data and the kinds of notice and access you have to give end users. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later. In the financial industry, you have the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, otherwise known as GLIBA. GLIBA is for banks, and it basically says that in addition to keeping its information confidential and secure, banks must also keep their customers' information confidential and secure. And so that's something that applies directly to banks. Most of us are familiar with HIPAA, Health Information or Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This is what states that health information is confidential and cannot be shared. And there are some pretty significant repercussions for having that kind of stuff leak out. HIPAA is one of the reasons why nobody can ask you if you've gotten a vaccine. If you go into a place, I don't know where you guys are at, Colorado is pretty open now as far as COVID goes. But if they can put a sign up that says, hey, please wear a mask if you haven't been vaccinated, but they can't ask if you've been vaccinated because that's a violation of HIPAA. That information is protected and nobody has a right to that information other than you and your healthcare provider. California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, very similar to GDPR. Colorado just passed a Consumer Privacy Act as well. I think Virginia has one. We're starting to see it more and more. And we'll talk about those again more when we get into data privacy. I think it's next Thursday, and we'll talk about that. But again, it has to do with keeping private information private. And then PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Digital or Data Security Standard. If you process credit cards, if you take credit cards for payments, then you're probably going to fall under PCI DSS requirements. And so that's private industry regulation. But if you are accepting credit cards, you have to comply or else they won't let you take credit cards anymore. So those are just, some of the different regulations or legislation that could apply to you. And if you do fall under the jurisdiction of this type of legislation, it is law. You must comply. And so typically regulatory compliance is going to be your highest priority when you start looking at securing the network, simply because it's the law. You have to do it and there's no way around it. Any questions about anything that we've talked about up to this point? Anything at all? All right, then let's go ahead and move right into our next section. I'm gonna have to swap out my slide deck, but let me go through my review sheet here and make sure that I know what I need to point out for the assessment next week. All right. Okay, let me swap out my slides. Give me just a second here. All right, so this is our second lesson of the evening and the last lesson of the evening. And here we're looking at threat actors and threat intelligence. And there's some terminology here that you need to be familiar with. This is very common terminology, not just for the exam, but also for practical experience as well. This is terminology that you'll hear every day. We're going to look at threat actors and what they are, and we're going to look at attack vectors and threat vectors and talk about what that is as well. And then we're going to look at threat intelligence and the different sources that we have for threat intelligence. So that's what we're looking at here, starting off with threat actor types and attack vectors. So looking at, when we look at security and evaluating security, you have resources and systems that we're protecting, okay? Those systems probably have vulnerabilities. A vulnerability is a weakness. A vulnerability is some sort of chink in the armor, okay? And it's something that can be exploited. A vulnerability is a weakness that can be exploited. The exploit is the thing that exploits the vulnerability. So for example, let's say that I have end users that are not educated. Well, that is a vulnerability, and it's a vulnerability that can be exploited. The way that I exploit it is maybe I send a phishing email. User clicks on the link, it downloads something malicious onto their computer, and that thing that gets downloaded on their computer is the payload, all that kind of stuff. But the vulnerability was the user in that particular case. That was the weakness. It's not the user's fault. If the user ends up being the vulnerability, that is your fault. That is my fault. It is not the user's fault, because it means that we did not educate our end users, and it's something that we have to do, okay? So the vulnerability is the thing that can be exploited. It's the weakness. The threat is the potential that somebody could exploit the vulnerability, okay? The threat could be intentional. It could be unintentional. It could be internal. It could be external. But the threat is the likelihood that a vulnerability can be exploited. The person or entity that poses the threat is called a threat actor or threat agent, but typically threat actor. And the tool or the path that they use to exploit the vulnerability is the vector, either the threat vector or the attack vector. So threat actor, threat agent, you will hear those terms used interchangeably, although threat actor is far more common. Threat vector and attack vector are terms that are used interchangeably. And matter of fact, if you go look in your CERT Master Learn, the diagram that's on the slide, instead of saying threat vector under threat, it says attack vector. So there's kind of a discrepancy there, but those terms are used interchangeably, okay? So when we're looking at this sort of thing, and I'm going to share out the whiteboard. Is everybody seeing the whiteboard at this point?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes, sir.
Excellent. So the way to remember this, okay, is let's say I've got a server, and that server is a web server, okay? And let's say that that web server has a known vulnerability. It's a buffer overflow that can allow execution of arbitrary code and privilege escalation, blah, 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 whatever. There's some sort of vulnerability. Okay, the vulnerability is what can be exploited. We need to know threat vector over attack. You mean like threat vector over attack vector? Like which term is more common?
Yes, sir. Or is it just go by both?
Go by both. I mean,
okay.
Yeah, they are really used interchangeably. In a given conversation with Josh and I, we'll talk about threat vector and attack vector. We're talking about the same thing, and it's just they really are that interchangeable. As far as the threat actor, we never say threat agent. We always say threat actor. but threat agent is also an acceptable term.
Okay.
Yep. So the vulnerability is what can be exploited. Okay. The bad guy, I'm going to draw my black hat here with his handlebar mustache, and he's got a mask. All right, this is the threat actor. That's the bad guy. And then whatever the tool or the path that the threat actor uses, this is the threat or attack vector. And my drawings just get worse from here, so fair warning. So the vulnerability is a thing that can be exploited. The threat actor is the person, the entity, the thing that poses the threat. And the threat vector or attack vector is the tool or the path used to exploit the vulnerability. So for example, let's say the vulnerability is an end user that is not educated. The threat vector or attack vector could be a phishing email. That's the path that I took or the tool that I used to try to exploit the vulnerability. Okay, on the assessment next Friday, write this down. You might get the question that says the tool used by an attacker to gain access to a resource is called what? The tool used by an attacker to gain access to a resource is called what? And the answer is threat vector. Now, as far as what you need to know for the exam, this is just terminology. This is like, you know, this is, I don't know, this is like, you know, we all drive cars and you mentioned parallel parking, right? It's just part of the conversation. Threat actor, threat vector, or attack vector. And by the way, I'm going to flip-flop between threat vector and attack vector. I can't help it. Just know that the terms really are interchangeable. But those are terms that, you know, if Josh and I are having a conversation, it's like, well, the threat actor did this. That's very common. Okay. Well, what was the vector? What was the attack vector? Oh, it was this. Again, it's as far as needing to know it for the exam, this is just basic terminology. But you do need to be familiar with the terms. Now, risk, I'm going to go ahead and move back to the slides here. When we look at risk, risk is the likelihood and the impact of the threat being realized. Okay, so let's say that, for example, here's a question that came up in a meeting I had this morning. So we're looking at implementing part of our solution, part of our network. We're looking at moving that into Microsoft Azure, which is their cloud solution. And the question that our chief development officer, our lead architect, our software architect developer, he said, well, by doing that, doesn't that put us at risk? Because, you know, if that's on Microsoft's platform, what if somebody at Microsoft decides that they want to do something and they go in and they you know, look at our stuff? I'm like, that's a great question, you know. And so at that point, we had to start talking risk. And so what I told him, I was like, you know what, Tim, that's a great question. And that's part of the, you know, as we explore this option for how we're designing the network, that's going to be part of the conversation. It's a really good thing you brought up. As far as the risk goes, you know, the impact, if they saw this, would be fairly low because of this, and this. The likelihood of it occurring is extremely remote for these reasons. So if we're going to look at the overall risk of this threat being realized, it's an extremely low likelihood and a fairly low impact. So the overall risk is negligible. Okay. So again, conversation I just had this morning. What about this? I had to be able to come back and talk in terms of risk. And in doing that and explaining it that way, you actually see light bulbs go off. People go, oh, okay, I get it. And then they're on board and you can move forward. But again, those are the kinds of conversations that you end up having. Vulnerability is the weakness or the thing that could be exploited. The threat is the potential that it could be exploited. The threat actor is the person or entity that poses the threat. The threat vector or attack vector is the tool or path they use to exploit the vulnerability. And risk is the likelihood and the impact of the exploit actually occurring. And so, be familiar with the terminology, not just for the exam, but from a practical standpoint as well. It is just industry standard terminology that you will see in everyday conversation. There's a special publication from NIST that is referenced in your course materials. I'll throw the link in here. It's NIST 800-30, which deals with risk management and everything. Any of the links, by the way, that I give you in the chat, this is good information, good background information and everything, but it's not necessarily something that you're going to see on the test. So don't think that just because I throw a link for, NIST 800-30, that you need to go and read that and take notes on it for the exam. This is just for, additional information, background information, that kind of thing. When we start looking at threat actors, was somebody going to ask a question? Did I interrupt somebody? Okay. Sorry, I want to make sure that I don't talk over anybody. So threat actors, who are these people? This has changed a lot over the years. The threat landscape has changed dramatically, over what it used to be. When we start trying to categorize or become familiar with different threat actors, there are different types that are out there. Historically, threats were pretty static. It's like, oh, well, we've got antivirus software, so we're okay. That was kind of how it was 15 years ago. It's, really now things are more behavioral. We're not necessarily looking at a particular payload or something like that, although that is part of it. We're really looking at behavior. And the way that we categorize and identify threat actors is going to be behaviorally in most cases. A threat actor could be internal or external. Of the two, which do you think poses the biggest threat, internal or external threat actors? Where's the biggest threat?
Internal.
Internal. Yeah, a lot of people are really concerned about, the hackers out on the internet, and we have to be concerned about that. We have to account for that. However, your biggest threat's internal. Do you know why? Or why do you think?
The weaknesses or the vulnerabilities.
The human denominator.
Well, yeah. What have you given all of your internal users?
The internal users.
Access.
Yeah, I've
Access.
given them all
Big.
access, right? All my internal users have some level of access. So
Internal
that's
users.
my biggest threat.
Internal
So that-
users might know your security protocols and use them against it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so we have to make sure that we're protecting both sides of this, internal and external. Now, other things about threat actors we have to take into account is intent. Some people do things maliciously. Other people do things accidentally. Generally speaking, your internal threat is going to be unintentional, accidental. It's not always the case, but that tends to be the case. whereas your external threat tends to be malicious. And again, that's not always the case, but that tends to be the case. It doesn't matter. We have to protect the same no matter what. But keep in mind, a lot of people, mistakes happen. I accidentally deleted something. I clicked on this link and I shouldn't have, that sort of thing. Accidents happen and we have to kind of keep that in mind. That's one of the things about security that, my boss, he is very fond of saying, and I've really bought into this. I've learned so much reporting to him over the last year and a half or so. But one of the things he always says is that the purpose of IT is to empower the business. The purpose of IT is to enable the business to do what it needs to do. That's what we do. And when it comes to security, we have to have that kind of mentality as well. We want to keep things safe, keep things secure, so that way the business can keep doing business. And we always want to look at things in a positive light. If I look at having tight security on the network, I am protecting my end users. I am protecting the network from the end users, but I am also protecting my end users as well. Because the better my security is, the less likely somebody can make a mistake that could have career-ending implications. So I want to protect my end users as much as I want to protect my network, and having good security in place is going to do those things. One of the things we have noticed about threat actors is their level of sophistication has changed dramatically over the years. When we start looking at the level of sophistication of what's out there, you have people that have almost unlimited funding and resources, and they have extremely high capability levels. And so because of that, we have to be on guard in cybersecurity. It's like I said before, this field's not going away. The threats are real. They're getting worse. They're becoming more sophisticated every day. And because of that, we have to stay on top of things, and companies have to put the money into security. There's no other choice. Let's go ahead and take a break. It is 2 minutes after. Let's take a break till 10 after. I'll try to get a little bit better on these break times as we go along. But let's take a break until 10 after, and then we're going to wrap this up and kind of review things and then talk about tomorrow. So let's take a quick break. so as we were saying, the threat actor, what the way that we categorize, the way that we look at threat actors has changed in recent years because the threat landscape has changed dramatically. And as I was saying, when we start looking at the level of sophistication that these threat actors have, it's really been a game changer. Again, we're dealing with people in some cases that have almost unlimited funding and resources. They have the backings of governments, that sort of thing. And so because of that, the capability level has gone way up. We see, this, and not only just coming from governments, but also crime, criminal syndicates, or organized crime, that sort of thing. So the landscape, again, it's changed a lot, and the threats are a lot more sophisticated than they used to be. In the past, we kind of worried about the lone hacker, that one person that's out there, sitting on a computer in their parents' basement, whatever. That kind of threat actor still exists. However, it's probably not as common as people would like to think. It's kind of a romanticized, version of what a hacker would be. The term hacker itself is actually not originally. The word hacker, or the term hacker, if that was applied to you, was more of a compliment than anything else. If you were writing code, if you were a sysadmin, on a network or a system or whatever, if somebody said you're really able to hack the code or hack the system or whatever it was, that meant that you really were good at it, that you could get it to do what you wanted it to do. The term cracker was the one that was dealing with the nefarious cracking code, cracking copyrights, that kind of thing. The term has evolved, and now you really never hear the term cracker for the bad guys. Instead, just the term hacker is kind of ubiquitous. So I bring that up because if you go back and look at some of the documentation and some of the tools that are out there from 20 years ago or something like that, you're going to see the terms are going to be a little bit different. Right now, instead of having different terms for the different types of people that are working with this kind of stuff, pretty much everybody is a hacker, and you're either a black hat, a white hat, or a gray hat. Black hats, those are the bad guys. Those are the threat actors. These are the ones who do not have authorization to do what they're doing. Those are your black hats. The white hats, the good guys, these are the ones that have authorization to do what they're doing, and they're working for the good. It goes back to the old Westerns, the Lone Ranger, that kind of thing. The bad guys always wore black hats, the good guys always wore white hats, and that's the terminology that's used today. A gray hat is where you have, it's kind of gray. They're kind of authorized, but they're kind of not. And this would be like people that are doing bug bounties and things like that, which we'll talk about later. But this is somebody who I'm not really getting approval or authorization to do what I'm doing, but I'm also not doing anything that is malicious. So maybe what I'm doing is trying to find vulnerabilities so I can report vulnerabilities. And that's where a bug bounty comes in. A bug bounty is where if I find a bug in an operating system, application, whatever, I can turn that into the developer and they'll give me money. They will reward me for finding those kinds of things. That tends to be kind of a gray hat kind of area. A script kiddie, this is actually a term I saw in my exam. A script kiddie is somebody who is able to run scripts, and that's about it. So they're able to download tools off the internet and use them to, they can follow these scripts and wreak some havoc or get some information or whatever. But they don't actually really know what they're doing. So this is a low resource, unsophisticated kind of attacker who, again, they can download some tools and use them. That's really about it. And the question that I got on my exam was something to the effect of, they kind of described that kind of threat. This would be somebody that has little knowledge or skills. However, they have access to tools that they can use to try to penetrate your network. That would be a script kiddie. Lack of knowledge, access to tools. That's kind of what we're looking at. And then other types of threat actors, you have hacktivists. I got this on my exam. So a hacktivist is a group that is motivated by ideology, politics, something like that. The example or the exam question that I got, it was a scenario where somebody there has, how do they put it? Something to the effect of the company's website was hacked and the threat actor disfigured the web pages of the corporate website, and the corporation, like somewhere in there, they said the corporation was like doing fracking or drilling or something, oil. And the threat actors put on all of the pages, material that, decried the use of, whatever. That basically this was, you're destroying the environment or something like that. And so what kind of threat actor was this? And the answer was hacktivist. A hacktivist group is a group who is politically or ideologically motivated. And that's why they do what they do. One of the terms that you'll see a lot, especially in the news recently, is APT, or Advanced Persistent Threat. The APT basically is really kind of a class of threat actor. When we look at an advanced persistent threat, or APT, what we're talking about are threat actors that tend to be attached to or funded by government agencies. Okay, see these coming out of Russia. We see them coming out of China, North Korea, Iran. Iran actually has some pretty good cyber capabilities, but and there are other places as well. But Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, those tend to be the big ones where we see a lot of this. And this is really, kind of scary stuff. I mean, these are groups that have that kind of funding available. And you look at a country like North Korea. North Korea is not exactly an economic powerhouse. Their people basically have very little. It's very much an impoverished nation. However, there's still enough money there for the government to be able to fund a very sophisticated cyber warfare program, and they do. And we see this activity a lot. The Colonial Pipeline, that was traced back to Russia. The SolarWinds hack in December were traced back to Russia. But we see these kinds of things all over the place. And APT is the term that is used to refer to these types of threat actors. Even though a lot of these we believe are backed by governments, it's kind of at arm's length. So that way there's the kind of plausible deniability where Russia can say, oh, well, that isn't us, but we believe that it is, that kind of thing. And it's, that's going to go back and forth. And there's also false flag operations where one government will do something and make, somebody else, make it look like somebody else did it, that kind of thing. Joshua, which one are you talking about? Are you talking about the Massachusetts ferry service, or which attack?
I'm not sure. It just popped up on the news a little bit ago. I wasn't paying too much attention to it, but it said that it was another ransomware found out there.
Yeah, the latest that I saw, July 3rd, that was Kaseya. That was the biggest one that happened recently. I don't know if that has been traced back to any particular entity. but I'll find out. I know that oh yeah, it's REvil. They're Russian. But that REvil might be organized crime, not necessarily government, but they are. But yeah, I'll give you a link to this. This is off of NPR. Yeah, it seems like a lot of the ones that we've looked at recently have come out of Russia. And again, it could be government backed, it could be organized crime. You know, organized crime is heavy into this. Now, where you see organized crime in today's world is not as much the ransomware and everything, although they do that. But you see it a lot with cyberjacking or cryptojacking, excuse me. I got my term mixed up. This is where they get software in your computer and they start mining cryptocurrency. They use your processing power and that kind of thing. And we'll look at types of malware tomorrow. But yeah, competitors, you know, we could worry about, you know, corporate espionage, that kind of thing could be something that we have to worry about with cybersecurity. I think probably really the big thing right now is advanced persistent threat, or APT. We see it happening more and more frequently, which is something that we need to be very concerned about, and we have to really be on guard to protect against. And honestly, the biggest thing we can do to protect against those things is educate our end users, because most ransomware comes into the network one of two ways, either through a phishing link to an end user or through an unpatched vulnerability on the operating system. And so patch management, end user education. If you do those two things, you're going to be pretty well protected. Insider threat actors, again, insider threats, that's our biggest threat because those people already have access to our systems. And so if there's some sort of misconfiguration on the network when it comes to access control lists and things like that, that's going to cause problems for us. So we have to make sure that we've locked those things down. Your insider threat could be an employee, could be a contractor. You could have partners, and you may have some sort of partner portal that that these business partners can log into and gain access to certain resources, that sort of thing. So we've got to, we have to look at those. This could be malicious. You could have somebody that is, maybe I've got a salesperson, and that salesperson, they know that they're leaving. So they start harvesting all of our contacts and sales information out of our, CRM solution. So that way they can take it with them to the next company that they're going to work for. It could be you have a developer that's leaving, and so they start, packing away source code, that sort of thing. These are all malicious threats that we have to take into account. And then also, as I said, unintentional, accidental things can occur as well. This can be averted if you have strong policies and procedures. You have to make sure that your policies are good, and you have to make sure that they are adhered to. Your policies and procedures have to have some teeth to them. So that way, if they're violated, there's some sort of recourse. And that's, you don't ever want to see somebody punished or disciplined or even terminated for not following a policy. That's always, because a lot of times it is unintentional. At the same time, we have to protect our environment. And so, having a policy is not enough. There needs to be some sort of consequence that happens if the policy is violated. And that's where a lot of companies struggle. We can put policies in place. However, we really kind of struggle when it comes to specifying what the consequences of breaking that policy, what those consequences are. And that's something that companies, you just have to kind of get through that and mature to the point to where you're willing to spell out consequences and enforce them. One of the big problems you run into, and I've said this before, is lack of training and security awareness. putting together a good security awareness training program for your end users is a huge thing. And it's really going to help you when it comes to keeping people informed, educated, and making sure that they adhere to policies. The last thing there is shadow IT. Now, shadow IT is a term that you need to be familiar with, and it's going to come up a couple of times in this course. Shadow IT is IT stuff that the IT department doesn't know about. So this could be, let's say that somebody installs a piece of software on their computer and they don't get permission from the IT department. Okay. Yeah. So are you a Marine, Brandon?
I was, sir.
Okay.
Once a Marine, I'm a Marine. So yes, sir, I'm a Marine.
I'm about to say, yes, you're a Marine.
Yeah. Well,
Calm
that's why I didn't say, did you used to be a Marine? Yeah. So, yeah, from what I understand, Marines do have, consequences.
Well, I'm
Actually,
not to make it seem like, hey, it's just hardcore all the time. No, everybody has their 5%, but every unit that I've been to has always been by the book.
yeah. Yeah. Well, Josh, our information security officer, he's a Marine, and that's where he got his cybersecurity training, was in the Marines, and then he went into the private sector and all of that. So, yeah, it's the Marine Corps mentality is a very valuable thing to have in your security person. It's also there's also some tempering that has to occur as well. And I'm not trying to just paint all Marines with the same brush, but there is kind of the Marines have there's just a different bearing,
Trust, sir, I totally understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, and it's a great, like I said, for your security guy, it's a real positive. It's a real good thing. However, there's also an opportunity for growth there where it's like, so Cameron, you a Marine?
No, I'm in the Air Force. I just give them a hard time because I work with Marines for a long time, so I know how they are.
Yeah, Air Force and Marines, my understanding is they're a little different. but yeah, that's yeah. Josh has really he has that by the book mentality, which you absolutely have to have within your cybersecurity people. You got to have it. However, the flip side to that is remember, the purpose of IT is to empower the business. Our job is to make sure the business can do business. And so we have to keep that in mind as we're looking at the security stuff as well. And whenever you do that sort of thing, whenever you're looking at, the security aspect of it, we've got to make sure we're by the book, but then we also have to know where we have to compromise and where we have to work with other people, because we have to empower people to do their jobs, but keep them safe while they're doing it. So, but shadow IT is that part of IT where things happen and the IT department doesn't know about it. Here's an example. So one of our engineers was doing a lab. This was a bomb disposal robot for a local law enforcement agency. And we were doing this just as a community outreach thing. We were building, they got this as military surplus. We were building it out for them to make it useful. And it was a really cool project. Well, Corey decided that, hey, we need to figure out how we're going to do this wirelessly. Okay. So he just plugged a wireless access point into the network and then started doing stuff. And us being, good at what we do, we noticed it. And it was like, whoa, what the hell? We have a wireless access point on our network. Why? And we were able to trace it down. And I had to go and talk to him and say, hey, man, you can't just stick things on the network. If you need a wireless network, we will set up a lab for you. We will make sure you can do what you need to do. But you can't just go and do this on your own. That's an example of shadow IT. Hardware or software on the network that the IT department doesn't know about. And that's real risk, because if we don't know about it, we can't secure it. And if we can't secure it, then, but if we can't secure it, then, that's going to put everybody at risk. let's see, attack surface and attack vectors. Now, here it's called an attack vector. What, 5 or 10 slides ago is called a threat vector. Okay, so remember I said those terms are used interchangeably. I tend to say attack vector. However, just remember that they're the same thing. Attack surface is a term that you will hear all the time with your in your job. Okay, the attack surface refers to all of the different ways that a threat actor could discover vulnerabilities and exploit them on a system. So if I look at attack surface, let's say that I have a web server. Okay, what is the attack surface? What are all the different points that somebody might be able to attack that machine? Well, I've got the operating system, which could have vulnerabilities and may need patching. I've got drivers that could be vulnerable. There's firmware down at the hardware level that could be vulnerable. I've got the web server software itself that's running and could have vulnerabilities. I may have multiple ports open that all point to that web server, things like that. If I look at all of the different ways that a particular system could be attacked, that is the attack surface. And when we talk about reducing the attack surface or hardening a system, we're talking about getting rid of as many points as we possibly can. So if, let's say I install a Windows server and I'm running IIS, Internet Information Services, on that server, okay? Well, if that's my web server, make sure that no other services are installed. Make sure I'm not running DNS or DHCP or FTP unless I need to for transferring files or whatever. But if there's a service running on that machine that doesn't need to run, shut it down. If there are ports that are open that don't need to be open, close them. If there are applications that you have installed but they're not being used, uninstall them. You want to reduce the attack surface as much as possible. And in doing that, this is referred to as hardening the machine. Okay. Now, as far as the different attack vectors that people can use, that threat actors can use to try to exploit a vulnerability, direct access is where somebody actually has direct access to the machine. You have to always make sure that things are physically secure. One old saying is, if I touch it, I own it. If I can touch that machine, I own that machine. And so you have to put, controls in place to mitigate that risk. Removable media, thumb drives, optical drives, things like that. This could be an attack vector. There's a case a case or scenario where, let's say that I put malicious code, I put some sort of payload on a thumb drive, and I go to a company, the Target, whoever this Target is, maybe it's Target, the retail store. Yeah, what's yours is mine, what's mine is mine. Yeah, that sounds a lot like a conversation I had with my wife recently. Something about what's mine is ours and what's hers is hers, or something like that. I don't remember. But which I'm fully on board with, because I couldn't do better. So, whatever she lays out, whatever her ultimatums are, I'm on board. No arguments here. But anyway, so let's say I've got some sort of exploit, some sort of payload that I have, malicious payload I have on a thumb drive, and I go to the company and I drop it in their parking lot, in the employee parking. What do you think most people are going to do when they walk out there and they see a thumb drive sitting on the ground? They're going to pick it up.
Pick it up, take it back to their doggone computer and stick it in to try to see who it belongs to. 9
times out of 10, that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to plug it in just so they can see, that's just, that's human nature. That's a good attack vector right there. Email, very, very common, phishing campaigns, things like that. Remote and wireless, remote access or wireless access. So maybe I can crack the encryption of your wireless network. Maybe you're using WEP or WPA. something like that. And so I can do a little bit of war driving, and I can, crack your network that way. Supply chain. Well, we just looked at Kaseya. Kaseya got hacked. They were talking about 1,500 different customers that may have been impacted. SolarWinds got hacked. 310,000 customers impacted. That's an example of supply chain, going after the supply chain there. Web, social media, I may have malware on a post. You click on the link and it, that sort of thing. You got to be very careful. And then, stuff that's in the cloud. We're going to talk about secure cloud services later on next week. But the thing to remember about the cloud, all of the security concerns that you have with all of your stuff on premise, on your own network, if you move to the cloud, all you're doing is taking all of your same security concerns and moving them. They all still exist. They just exist somewhere else now. And on top of that, you have more concerns, more risk that you have to worry about. So cloud, everybody loves talking about, oh, let's put it in the cloud. Is it cloud? Is it cloud? Is it cloud? It has its place, but there are considerations anytime you put anything in the cloud. Any questions about anything we've talked about up to this point?
Sir.
All righty. Well, let's wrap it up. We've got one more topic where we look at threat intelligence sources. So we know that we've got threat actors out there. We know that they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing. So the question becomes, how do we figure this stuff out? How do I figure out who the bad guys are? How do I figure out what they're doing? A lot of the terminology in here comes from military terminology. Okay. And the first thing we're talking about is counterintelligence. When you look at what the threat actors are doing, threat actors, we're going to look at the kill chain attack cycle when we get into incident response next week. And this is basically the different stages that you go through when you're attacking a target. And the first stage is always going to be reconnaissance. It's going to be intelligence gathering. And so a threat actor is going to try to gather as much intelligence about the target as they possibly can. What we're trying to do as the good guys is we're trying to develop as much counterintelligence as we can. And we do this by trying to discover the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the threat actors. Okay. And so we're looking at basically, what is their strategy? What kind of campaign are they running? What attack vectors are they using? And what are the tools and the techniques that they use to exploit these vulnerabilities? And that's what we're trying to do. The nice thing is there are a lot of sources out there where you can get this kind of information. There are different universities and other think tanks and academic organizations that are doing research into this stuff all the time. You also have, different vendors who are researching, what their customers are seeing. So, I can have things like, I could be Cisco. Cisco has firewalls, the Cisco ASA next generation firewalls. That's what we use. Fortinet has their FortiGate stuff. You have Sophos, Kaspersky with their antivirus. I mean, you have all of these different security companies, and they are all analyzing the data that's being reported back to them by all of their different customers. And they are publishing this information and making it readily available. So we can go to them and we can find out exactly what's happening. Another thing that you can use is a honeypot or a honey net. And we're going to get into that in more detail later. But a honeypot is where you have a computer that has vulnerabilities and you leave it that way. You might even configure it specifically to have vulnerabilities. And so you do that kind of to serve as an early warning system, because if I'm a threat actor and I am running recon on your network If I do a vulnerability scan and I see that that computer over there has these 3 known vulnerabilities, then I'm going to go after that one first, most likely, because we all like low-hanging fruit, right? And so hopefully I have systems in place that give me alerts when that kind of activity is spotted. And if that's the case, when my systems see the attacker, the threat actor going after that particular system, then I get alerts. But honeypots can be a valuable resource of information of seeing what it is that threat actors are doing. You also have you have what's known as the deep web, the dark web, and dark nets. And this terminology is advertisers love to talk about the dark web. LifeLock and people like that. So the deep web, the World Wide Web, or the web, is all of the internet that is indexable by bots and search engines. That's the World Wide Web, okay? And it gets its name from the fact that if you look at all of these pages and all of the links that point to each other, it's like a web. Anything that is not indexable by a search engine is known as the deep web. So this would be stuff like, if you go to, like, for example, you go to the ACI learning page to get into this course, you can't get to the link to get into the Zoom class unless you log in. That content is behind a login wall. That kind of stuff, Google can't index what's behind a login wall. So that's what's known as the deep web. I don't think that term will come up, but that's the term. The dark web is content that is only accessible over a dark net. And a dark net is a network that exists on the internet, and it is used to obfuscate and anonymize activity on the internet. An example of this is Tor, the onion router. Yep, Rodney, exactly. So if you are somebody who is concerned about your privacy, and a lot of people are, just because you use Tor or a dark net program doesn't mean you're doing anything nefarious or whatever. It's simply, a lot of people they are worried about their privacy. So they'll use a dark net program, or they'll use VPN or whatever. So the way that Tor works is you have a lot of systems out there, servers out on the internet. These are put out there voluntarily. And when you connect to them, they will, so let's say that I am using the Tor browser, for example, okay? You can download this. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly where you find the Tor browser. I think it's, I don't know, Rodney, if you want to throw a link out there. But anyway, if you download and install the Tor browser, and let's say you go to Amazon.com, what will happen is your link will actually bounce through different servers, and the connection will actually be recorded at Amazon from a different IP address than yours. And all of the connections in between are encrypted, okay? This is, again, not necessarily something that you're doing that's wrong or sneaky. It just is, it's just trying to protect your privacy. How is it different from incognito, and is it the same as DuckDuckGo? Good questions, Brandon. Incognito or private mode or whatever you see in your browser. So this is a setting on your browser. So if I'm in incognito or private or whatever it is, that tells my browser not to track my history, not to download, cookies or download content, to not cache it, that kind of thing. So it's your browser, but it's only your browser. DuckDuckGo, if I remember correctly, DuckDuckGo is a browser, or excuse me, a search engine that doesn't track my search history. So like if you go to Google, okay, and let's say that you launch your browser in incognito mode. So I'm in incognito mode and I go to google.com and I do a search for whatever. Okay. I do a search for crowbars, just random off the top of my head. What will end up happening is the search results that come up for crowbars will appear in my browser. When I click on those links and everything else, that will not be tracked in my history. They won't be cached. The content will not be stored on my hard drive. That's what incognito does for me. It makes it private on my computer. However, Google has still tracked that I searched from my IP address for crowbars at this date, at this time, and that this was the browser being used and all that kind of stuff. My browser settings have no control over what Google's doing. Now, my understanding is if I went to DuckDuckGo and I did a search for crowbars, DuckDuckGo does not cache that information or track that information. And so it can't be correlated back to me or my IP address. That's my understanding. What do you mean by spiders?
So like, I know Google normally use like spiders in their networking that goes out and collect the information and stuff like that. So it
Yeah.
basically doesn't stop the spiders.
Nope, not at all.
Okay.
Yep. Now let's say that you use the Tor browser and you go to google.com to search for crowbars. When you go to google.com, the Tor browser is actually going to connect you to, like, well, take a look. You see on the slide there, you look where it says, this browser, Italy, Sweden, Germany, so and so and so on. In order for me to go to google.com, it's going to route me through 3 or 4 different hops. And then from one of those other servers, it connects to google.com. So Google thinks that the connection is coming from a different IP address than my own. So it can't be traced back to me at all. And all of the connections in between me and that server that routed me to Google are all encrypted. So my traffic is protected. Okay, so you can't see my traffic, and then my request or my interaction with that website can't be tracked back to me either. So it is just simply a different level of privacy. So that's where a dark net, that would be the difference between using like a dark net and some of those other things. And then dark web is referring to content that exists only on, these dark networks. You can only access them by going through these servers. And typically those are going to be, they're not on search engines or anything like that. For you to get to a site on a dark net, it would be, somebody would have to word of mouth. Basically, I'd have to say, okay, well, Brandon, here's the URL to get to this content, that kind of thing. So it's just a different kind of world. And there's a lot of information out there. This is where a lot of, sales of private information and things like that can occur, is on websites like that. And so anyway, but you've got companies out there as well that are on the dark net, and they are on dark networks, and they're looking at that content and trying to get information as much as they can. Now, we're going to have some sort of system on our network that is going to allow us to look at activity on our network and correlate that to known threats. Okay, and so there are different ways that we can get that kind of threat intelligence. Some of it would be feeding known threat information into our systems, and others are just, other ways that you can do this. When you're trying to learn about the different threats that exist, and you're trying to accumulate threat intelligence, one of the basic ways you can do this is through news feeds. Well, first, narrative analysis and commentary. Let's look at that bullet point first. This is where you go to, blogs and and websites and that sort of thing, and you read articles and people saying, hey, we discovered this and this is how you mitigate that threat and that sort of thing. You can also get data feeds, and this is known as cyber threat intelligence, or CTI. And CTI data can come to you in a couple of different ways. It might be that I have a feed that I get that automatically updates my security information and event monitoring system, my SIM. That could be something. Or it could be, again, I go and I get this from reading websites, and I go to, like, you can go onto Google and go to news, and you can customize what you see in the news, and you can specify, go in there and tune it to where you're seeing cybersecurity stuff, and that'll keep you up to date on your on threat information. And that's a really good way of doing things. My principal systems engineer, Joe, that's what he does. We find out all kinds of stuff, Also keep in mind that vendors send out information as well. I get an email from Cisco every week or two, which specifies, here are all the security vulnerabilities we've discovered, and here's what you need to do. There are proprietary platforms and feeds that you can get. IBM has one called X-Force. You have FireEye. They're really, they're really big into this. You also have some open source ones out there as well, like Alien Vault, which is now owned by AT&T, or Spam House, VirusTotal, Mist. There's all kinds out there where you can get this kind of information. And one thing about open source intelligence, and we're going to talk about OSINT in a couple of different contexts, but not only can we go out there and get information like cyber threat intelligence through open source programs like Alien Vault or VirusTotal or whatever. As an attacker, OSINT, or open source intelligence, is an extremely valuable way for me to gather reconnaissance information about the target. There's a tremendous amount of information in social media. Think about it. People go on Facebook and they check in like, hey, I'm at this restaurant. Or, people give out way too much information about themselves on social media. And so as a threat actor, I can go out and get a ton that's just out there waiting for me to look at. Other sources, academic journals, again, you have all kinds of different institutes out there. Conferences. So look, I would think a lot of you in the San Antonio area, I know here, even in Colorado Springs, if you have a lot of military, there are going to be conferences, cybersecurity conferences that will be, cybersecurity expos and things like that will be put on by like your Chamber of Commerce or something. And those are really good sources of information. You can go there, you can learn a lot. I went to one 2 years ago. We didn't do one last year, obviously, but went to one 2 years ago, and I just learned so much about new threats, new threat actors, and some of the different things that the intelligence agencies are kind of have on their radar and things we need to look at. Another thing about conferences that are really good, it's a great networking opportunity for you. As you're looking to transition, find a job, you'll get really, really good contacts there as well. RFCs, anytime let's say that I decide to develop a new and better way of sending email on the internet. I'm going to write a white paper that specifies technically how I'm going to do this. I will submit that to the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, okay? And it's going to be published as a request for comment, this article. And if it's adopted as a standard, then that RFC will be published as a standard. You can go look at RFCs, the actual standards for these protocols, and see how you can do things. They are not at all interesting, really hard read. But, if you're really wanting to dig in, you can go look at the RFCs and see how the protocols are actually written. And again, like I said, lots of information you can find on social media as well. For those of you who are looking for work, one of the things that you can look at, I believe LinkedIn. So there was a company called lynda.com, which was online training. LinkedIn bought it. Now it's LinkedIn training. They actually, I think they have free courses on how to utilize LinkedIn and social media to help get your name out there and help with a job search. So that might be something that's good to look at. TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and indicators of compromise. You'll see TTPs mentioned throughout the course, and I don't know if it's really something that you'll hear from a practical standpoint in everyday conversation, but it is something that you will hear in the course from, as we move through this. When we talk about TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, we're really looking at what it is that a threat actor is doing. We're looking at their behavior. We're looking at what are the different tactics that they're using. So they're kind of their approach. What is the overall campaign that they're trying to do? And then when we look at the techniques, we're looking at the different, attack vectors that they're using. Using emails, phishing campaigns, things like that. And then the procedures would be the actual specific payload that's being delivered. So maybe if I'm REvil, and that's the group, and I'm using the Ryuk ransomware, maybe the general campaign or strategy, the tactics are going to be, I am targeting a particular industry, for whatever reason. I'm trying to disrupt communications and infrastructure or whatever. Well, then from there, what are my attack vectors? Well, I'm sending out phishing emails. That's my attack vector. And then the actual specific tool that's the payload that's being delivered is the Ryuk ransomware kernel, that kind of thing. So that's what we're talking about with TTPs. And this is information that you're getting, hopefully, from a provider that outlines here are all of these different things that we know about. On the other hand, you have an indicator of compromise. And this is a term that you hear a lot in the course, but also from a practical standpoint. Josh and I were talking today, and we were talking about indicators of compromise because we were trying to figure out something that we saw on our SIM. Well, an indicator of compromise is exactly that. It is a data point that indicates you may have had some sort of security compromise that occurred. Now, in and of itself, that one data point may not mean anything. However, when taken as a whole, where you have a pattern that has emerged, and you can correlate that back to your cyber threat intelligence. If I can take these indicators, match them up with the threat intelligence, then that might show me that a security event is underway or it has already occurred. And then based on that, I can do some sort of response. Now, there's going to have to be some sort of artificial intelligence involved. This could be cloud-based. It could be built into your SIM. It just depends on what you're doing. But typically, you will have a system in place where you can feed your cyber threat intelligence. It will then analyze the different data points, indicators of compromise that it sees on your network, and then it will correlate those. It will draw relationships between those and alert you that a particular security event has occurred. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. Now, how this works, you will end up getting a data feed of some sort with your CTI, your cyber threat intelligence, that will be downloaded into your security system, your security event information and event monitoring system, your SIM. And then that's where you will get your alerts and everything. As far as how those threat data feeds come in and the kind of terminology you need to know about, we have a couple of slides on that, and we'll pick that up tomorrow. It'll take us about 5-10 minutes to get through. So we're doing fine on time. So that's as far as we're going to go tonight. Like I said, we have like 2 more slides, so not a big deal. Any questions about anything that we've talked about tonight? Anything at all? All right, cool deal. Well, it is pretty much time for us to stop. So I want you to know I really appreciate you guys taking the time to hang out here tonight. Tomorrow we'll wrap this up and then we're going to move into our next lessons talking about, I want to say we're talking about social engineering. Yeah, we're going to look at social engineering and malware, and we're going to talk about security assessments and penetration testing. What's the difference and how do we do them? And so that's what we've got on deck for tomorrow. So again, any questions for me before we end it for the night? Anything at all? Cool. All right. Have a wonderful
Sir.
night, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a good one.
Sir, that's
Thank
social
you.
engineer. Sir.
Did you
Sir,
leave?
Yeah, I'm here. What's up?
oh, this the what chapter is that? I mean, what lesson is that? The social engineering?
So tomorrow will be lessons 3 and 4.
3 and 4? Okay.
Yeah, 3 is hell, I just looked at it. 3 is security assessments and penetration testing, and then lesson 4 is social engineering and malware.
Social engineering. Okay,
Yep.
I got it.
All righty.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Have a good
sir.
one.
Thank you, sir. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.